Everybody. Welcome. I'm so grateful. People have shown a lot of interest in this Instagram Live because I'm going to be joined by my wonderful friend and colleague, Gabor Maté. And we are going to be talking tonight about a project that is part of my Marianne 2024.com agenda in my campaign for the presidency. I developed a lot of this material with my friend Matthew Albrecht. It's called Healing Root Causes Solutions for Personal and Collective Repair. And if you go to Marianne2024.com, you will read all about it. But tonight was meant to be a conversation with Gabor and myself. So Gabor is sort of calling in, and then I'm supposed to accept, right? So Lauren, I'm going to see this somewhere where he writes in and, oh, view request? Yes, Gabor Maté, view request. So what do I say? Accept. We keep accepting him and it's not working.
Hello.
Oh, hey, how are you, my friend? How are you, Gabor?
Okay. Well, how am I? Thanks for asking. It's been a tough time. I just came back from a 5-week speaking trip in Europe, and then this terrible tragedy unfolded in the Middle East. I've been quite engaged with that. I know it's an issue close to your heart. So it's a heavy time, I think, for a lot of people. I'm very glad to be talking with you, talking with somebody whose vision of health encompasses all the social and international and community factors that contribute to people's health. So I'm looking for this conversation, and it's been a tough time.
Thank you. I always look forward to any conversation with you. And actually, there's no one I'd rather talk to at times of deep feeling. Let me ask you, was the kind of responses and conversations that you were hearing, you were in Eastern Europe, is that right?
Well, as a matter of fact, I had 10 days in the former Yugoslavia, which, as you know, was recently the venue of terrible inter-community and intersectional trauma and atrocities. And now it's 25, 30 years later, and people are still hurting, but they're living together and they're working together and they're even healing together, although it's going to take a long time. So it shows you what's possible. And everywhere I went, people were so open and so friendly and so receptive. And so what I'm convinced about is that people everywhere, whether they're Canadians or Americans, as you and I are, whether they're Jews or Christians, whether they're Palestinians or Israelis, the average person just wants peace in their family, in their communities. And it's too bad that the way politics works, it sets people against each other so terribly. But the goodness is inside everybody. That's my sense of it. And I'm sure that's yours as well.
Of course. And of course, when it comes to Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Jews, for centuries lived together peacefully. As a matter of fact, much more peacefully for many centuries than either group experienced with Christians. So
That's
it's
true.
a great tragedy, and we can only hope that it is an aberration, and we don't just hope, we're convinced, because hopefully we will do everything possible to make it happen, that in our lifetime we will get back. I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking, in the centuries ago, England went to war with France. People that, the last thing we think of now is warring with one another at various times in their history have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so Marianne, so let's come back to your issue right now, which is your run for presidency. And I've had opportunity to review your program, your very comprehensive plan for health, and which is not a group of political cliches. It's a really detailed program that you've worked out. But let me introduce it by quoting two people. Okay, one is Dr. Rudolf Virchow, Virchow, who's still a very well-known name in medical circles. He's known as the father of modern pathology, actually, and he was a German physician. And he was asked to investigate an outbreak of typhus, I think, in a part of Germany that was mostly Polish. And his solution went way beyond the medical, and he introduced these people should have the right to speak their language. They should have community control and so on. And he was asked, what are you talking about? This is politics, not medicine. And Virchow said two things that are classical, and I'd like to quote them to you, because it totally pertains to your program. The first thing he said was that for if medicine is really to accomplish this great task, it must intervene in political and social life. It must point out the hindrances that impede the normal social functioning of vital processes and effect their removal. And then he said even more sharply, he said, his solution to the typhus outbreak was separation of church and state, allowing the Poles to speak their own language, education for both sexes, and above all, free and unlimited democracy. And people said to him, what are you talking about? This is not medicine. And he said, medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. And when I read your program, that's so much in the spirit of what this great man said 150 years ago. And the final thing I wanted to quote was Mary Trump. I don't know if you've talked with Mary, but she is Donald's niece, whose father died of alcoholism, and who wrote a very telling family biography, really. And then she wrote a subsequent book called The Reckoning, and in which she says two things. She says, we're a nation shackled by a cultural imperative to move on from the pain of war, mass death, disease, and government-sanctioned barbarity in the name of peace or healing, or a return to normal, when all we've really been doing is preserving the unchecked impunity of the powerful to inflict pain again, and again.
Wow.
And finally, our current trauma is the combination of our history, the logical outcome of stories that we tell ourselves, the myths we embrace, and the lies we perpetuate. Trauma shapes us in ways we may not be aware of, and will always do so unless we face what has happened to us, what we've done to ourselves, and what we've done to each other. Without looking through that lens, we cannot fully understand what has unfolded. And it seems to me, as I reviewed your very detailed and very thoughtful plan for national health in your country, this is exactly the lens that you're looking through.
That's such an extraordinary line, that politics is medicine on a large scale.
Yeah.
Because I do see politics as simply our collective behavior, and the same principles apply collectively as apply individually. There are ways to try to live your life that are in harmony with nature, harmony with life, and all systems respond, including your physical system. And exactly. I think politics is simply creating a space where that can be as true for the greatest number of people. And then and as far as Mary Trump is concerned, she is a voice, and how ironic that she would be his niece. But I think it's also understandable because she's a little bit of a ground zero of the cruelty that this man has inflicted, right? And she, I think, really has articulated in ways that a lot of people can understand that he is a symptom of everything that you were just talking about. I mean, if you think about it, decades ago, we started making the businessman God. And so, of course, the most perverted archetype, the most perverted form of that character would be in front of us. And I think...
Well, Donald Trump once said that, and I'm paraphrasing him very closely now, he said that the world is a horrible place. It's dog eat dog. Your friends want your wealth, your power, your wife. These are your friends, he said. And now, if that's the world he lives in, that's the world he's going to create. And a lot of our leaders live in that kind of world. And a lot of them, like the big difference between yourself, for example, and most people in politics is you're self-reflective. You've been very open about your own challenges with emotional health. You've talked about them, you've given interviews about them. Most politicians are not self-reflective. They're afraid, and if you ask them why not, many of them will say, because I don't want to find out what's in there. And Trump has said that, Hillary Clinton has said that. You know, the result is that there's all this unresolved trauma, and then no, Trump. When you look at him, just as an example, right? My friend, the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, has called him a poster boy for trauma. I mean, one way to look at him, not that there should be a discussion about him, but he's an extreme but not untypical political leader in a lack of self-reflection and in the magnification of his ego and his hunger and even compulsive need for power and to be right, to the point. And he earned in the sense that he grew up in a household that Mary Trump says was run by her because a sociopath. And the coping mechanisms that Trump developed, denial of reality, self-aggrandizement, profit hunger, power hunger, they serve him well in politics in a country that worships power and worships wealth.
But I like to think that in my lifetime, that there was a time when I was younger when he would not have been embraced as he is. So it speaks to where the culture is.
I think
that we would be vulnerable to someone such as he. There's been a kind of ideological capture.
I think it's totally true, and you talk about it in your program when you talk about the declining life expectancy, for example, in the U.S. And as we know, especially the life expectancy of non-university educated white males has been dropping dramatically, and these have been called deaths of despair. And there's despair for all kinds of reasons, for social dislocation, the hollowing out of the American industrial heartland, the growing isolation, the breakup of communities, all the things that you address in your program. And it's out of that despair that a man like that then finds traction. And in that sense, it's not unusual in history that at times of dislocation and despair, it's extremes that find resonance with the public who are desperate for some strong figure to save them from their despair. And people don't practice self-reflection at a time like this.
You know, I worked at a non-denominational church, a spiritual center of sorts in Detroit, back during the time of the housing crisis when there was the real economic crisis. And I noticed something very different when I was counseling women versus when I was counseling men. If a woman, and this is a broad generalization, but it was my experience, if a woman would come in and she just lost her job, she would be, how am I going to pay for the rent? How am I going to feed the children?
Yeah.
What am I going to do? I mean, it was certainly an external crisis. I'm not saying it didn't have emotional layers and dimensions, but it was externally focused and externally addressed. With men, I would find it much more of a psychic crisis.
Yeah.
He's not the producer in his home. My wife will not respect me. My kids will not respect me. The idea that my wife is making the money and I'm not, the fact that I'm home all day, the masculine within us all, but certainly that you see so much in men, need to produce and to be respected. And so this dislocation that you're talking about, the disruption of communities, where a man, there was a time, or a woman, if you look in the 1970s in the United States, the average American worker had decent
Yeah.
benefits and could afford a home, could afford a house, could afford a car, could
Yeah.
afford a yearly vacation, could afford to send their kids to school. So people could feel dignity and people could feel pride in their production, providing for their families.
Yeah.
And so all of this dislocation, and for what? Just so that huge corporate entities could make more money. And meanwhile, this person is paying their tax dollars that go in many ways to subsidize and to enable those same forces, which are blowing their lives apart. And I think that what we're seeing now is the great flowering evil spawn of this process that's been going on for so many decades. And so you're right. Donald Trump is just this kind of, you have that much despair, and you see this in whether it's in a corner of an American city or you see it anywhere in the world. Large groups of desperate people are a security risk. They form a petri dish out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction is almost inevitable, whether it's addiction, whether it's violence and crime. None of this should surprise us.
In the United States last year, more than twice as many people died from drug overdoses as died in 1 year, as died in all the years as Americans who died in all the Vietnam War, the Afghan War, and the Iraqi War. That's in 1 year. And
That's exactly right.
and as you and I both know, addictions are a response to despair. And despair on the individual level, but also despair on the social level. So there's such a thing that has been called social dislocation, where people lose their sense of meaning and their sense of value in the context of their society. So, especially as you said, for men, who are expected to be tough and not vulnerable and be the providers and the protectors, when you pull the rug from under their feet, literally, they lose their sense of self, and this is not an inner society that separates individuals from each other and says it's all your personal responsibility, and if you don't succeed, it's all your fault. Well, then people buy into that ideology,
and then they hate themselves more. And the self-hatred contributes. Several years ago, with the opioid crisis in New Hampshire mainly, there was all of that talk about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharmacy and the predatory behavior having to do with the OxyContin and so forth. And so many of the attorneys general in the United States got together, they sued, they shut a lot of that down. They, got to the pharmacists, a lot of that stuff was cut off, that pharmaceutical company and so forth. But what they then found, which would not be a surprise to you and me so much, but was certainly a shock to that system, is that the deaths, the overdoses did not go down dramatically. And they didn't go down dramatically because it was never just about the drugs. It was about the hungry ghost inside people, right?
Yeah.
And
sorry, speaking of which, I do want to talk something in your program. You talk a lot about food and health. Now, if we're going to talk about the drug companies and the pharmaceutical companies and their really conspiratorial, this is not conspiracy theory, this is conspiracy reality. The conspiratorial approach to sell drugs that are harmful, that they knew were harmful. Look at the food companies. They've been out of it a long time ago. So that a lot of the junk foods that people consume and that is so bad for their health. I mean, look at the epidemic of diabetes and people having to use drugs to lose weight. Well, the food companies, again, this is not theory, this is proven fact, conspire and they hire scientists to figure out what they call the sweet spot, where the most addictive combination of salt, sugar, and fat. In fact, that was the name of a book, a prize-winning book a few years ago, sugar, salt, sugar, and fat. What combination will most trigger the most addictive part of the brain? So it's literally a conspiracy to hook people onto addictive foods. And who's most susceptible?
children.
Children and poor people.
Right.
and
Well,
they pay the price.
right.
Health.
There was an article recently that got a lot of attention here, Gabor, which had to do with the ingredients in a ketchup bottle in the United States versus the ingredients in a ketchup bottle in Canada.
Yeah.
Because both in Canada and in European countries, so many of the artificial chemicals that are put in food so that they can have a longer shelf life and so forth in the United States are forbidden. They're illegal in Canada. They're illegal in Europe. And also the obesity, of course. A lot of times the obesity in children is not because they're eating so much, it's that they're starving. They're actually starved of nutrients. They live in food deserts, etc. So they keep eating because the body is just trying to get the nutrients that it's not getting, so they eat more.
Right. That's right.
But
and if you look at
go on.
the statistic in Canada, and I'm sure they're similar in the States, Indigenous people in Canada, who are the most historically traumatized and most politically marginalized and most socially oppressed even now, and I could tell you horror stories, they're much more likely to have diabetes 20, 30 years earlier than Caucasian people. And in the United States, and you talk about the racialization of health in your program, and you mentioned racial factors. Well, in the United States, if you look at the chromosomes in terms of their aging, their biological aging, they're older in Black people than in Caucasians. And if you look at autoimmune diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and others, where the immune system attacks the body, and everybody says, we don't know what causes it. Well, the hell we don't. It's stress and pressure. And if you look at people of color in the States, whether Hispanic or Black or others, they have much higher rates of these diseases, which they didn't back in their countries of origin.
Right, right. And also, obviously, we're not only talking about the prevention of disease, even the treatment of disease. We have in the United States 1.3 million people who are rationing their insulin. Now, you don't have that in Canada. You don't have that in any advanced democracy. It's horrifying. And I have heard of people, I was talking to a woman actually, so she had to choose between her rent and her insulin.
Yeah.
And she was saying, well, if I hate to take my kids out of our home, but even if we're living in a car, they still have a mother.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
horrifying that in the richest country in the world, this would be the situation. And there's no other reason than the institutionalized greed of insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, of this matrix of corporate overlords that really hold our government hostage and in many ways control every sector of our society at this point.
One of the radical suggestions you make in your program is that there should be long doctor's visits. So,
is that there should be what?
There should be longer doctor's visits.
Well, not only that, but in our whole health plan, we have it that, of course, it's a Medicare for all universal health care type plan, but we have it so that if you go to the doctor, because as you well know, most doctors in America today, in the United States anyway, are so much more schooled in pharmaceutical treatments. Right, traditional treatments than anything non-pharmaceutical. So we have in the whole health plan that it is mandated by law that if you go to see a doctor and that the doctor prescribes you medicine or whatever, that you are also shown on the computer any non-pharmaceutical, non-allopathic treatment that has been proven efficacious. I think it's about changing the paradigm in everything.
Yeah. In your program, you also talk about prevention, like that prevention needs to be an important aspect of health. In medical school, they just don't talk about that. I mean, they'll talk about simple things like smoke and, don't eat too badly, although they don't say much about that. But the whole idea of prevention on the social and community scale that you talk about in your program is simply ignored. And the whole idea of the mind-body unity, which from the scientific point of view is not even vaguely controversial, is not even touched upon in the training of the average medical doctor.
Well, it's interesting because throughout my political experiences,
Yeah.
I'm referred to as kooky or wacky
Yeah.
by people who are stuck in 1975 in
Yeah.
their failure to recognize the body mind connection. So I'll see myself called wacky for saying something that ever since like about the 1990s now, this has been part of mainstream
Yeah.
thinking in the most advanced uh, medical, not medical schools, but medical institutions in North America. This connection is so proven at this point. I heard James Doty. I'm sure you know James Doty, right? I'm sure you know Jim. And I heard him talk about how even in the last 10 or 20 years, they've discovered more of a highway between the head and the heart than they
Oh,
had
yeah.
realized existed in terms of the intelligence of the body, that they had previously thought that the brain was the intelligence center of the body
Yeah.
and that was
Yeah.
it, but now they recognize so much more. I mean, people used to talk about somebody dying of a broken heart,
Well,
but really what we're saying is that people do die of a broken
well,
heart.
they do. And not only, and by the way, not, as James says, it's the cerebrum up here and the nervous system in the heart and also the gut.
The
So
gut.
for full intelligence, all three need to be connected, you know. And in your program on health, you bring up trauma a number of times. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
let me tell you, let me tell you a quick story, which is really amazing. In 1939, there was a Hungarian doctor like me at Harvard University. His name was Soma Weiss, and he's so revered that to this day they have a day in his honor every year at Harvard. And Soma Weiss gave a lecture in 1939, which was reprinted in the Journal of the American Medical Association. You said the 1970s. This is 1939, and he said that emotional psychological factors are as important in the causation of illness as physical factors, and they need to be at least as important in their treatment. Now, he said this in 1939. The article was published in JAMA in 1940. 4 years ago, I was talking to a leading psychiatrist at Harvard, a very well-known guy, and he said, to this day, to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard is to jeopardize your career.
We're
And
going backwards because I remember there was a time 20 years ago or so when there was a Harvard
yeah,
symposium on integrative medicine. There's so many ways now that we're going backwards. It's just shocking to me.
and one of the things you recommend in your program actually is bringing in what's called functional medicine and integrative medicine, which are much more holistic ways of understanding human health and human illness. And um, I just have to say that as I read to your program, all I could do is go check, 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 because
Oh, thank you.
there's nothing radical there, or what's the only thing that's radical about it is its common sense, you know, and that says more about the world that we live in than actually about your program, you know.
Well, the political system is stuck back in the 1990s. They're stuck back in the 20th century, a very mechanistic paradigm. The world is a big machine, and consciousness has very little to do with what happens on the realm of the machine,
Yeah,
which is, we know, is just a realm of the symptom. It has nothing to do with root causes. And the 21st century is far more holistic, whole person. And one of the ways that my candidacy has been peripheralized, marginalized, is, oh, she's fringe. And as you were saying, there's nothing fringe about this. What's fringe today is to not recognize that people have an inner life as well, and that the inner life affects the outer. And that when you have public policies that so traumatize people internally, you were going to have external problems. You know, Gabor, when I was running before,
yeah,
I met elementary school principals who told me they had elementary school students on suicide watch.
yeah,
Elementary school students on suicide watch. And I'm sure you know that they have in public schools throughout the country trauma rooms. Trauma rooms, and I remember when people were first starting to talk about trauma informed education. I thought that was so great and all of that. And of course it is. However, we have to ask ourselves, why is childhood such a trauma for so many of these
well,
children?
fact in fact, if you look at the statistics, the rate of childhood suicide in the States is going up. And both the New York Times and the New Yorker, sometime within the last year, had these anguished articles about this is happening and nobody knows why. Well, the hell we don't know
That's
why.
exactly right. The hell we know what we don't know why. I know. I can't stand that.
I know
Exactly.
why, because you talk
We've
about in
done.
your the stress that parents are under is translated to stress on the children, and the um, desperate hunt just to make a living that people have to face makes them less available to connect emotionally with their children. Not because they don't love their kids, but simply because they don't have the emotional presence of mind and the time. And now those kids whose parents may love them, but if the parents are stressed and emotionally somewhat distant, they don't receive the love. So they feel desperate. That's why the increase in childhood suicides. You know,
And
and,
we cannot overstate the significance of economic anxiety
yeah,
as a root cause for why these parents are so upset. Like I said, if back in the 70s, one salary,
yeah,
one parent could afford to stay home, and one salary could afford to support the family of four, one job, they have a house, they have a car, they could take a vacation, they could send their kids to college.
yeah,
There's so much more bandwidth, there's so much less stress. But we have adopted an economic paradigm that is so infused into our public policy, which is just short-term corporate profits at the expense of life, at the expense of what it takes for people to live with dignity, to live without trauma, without economic anxiety. We have 70% of the American people who say that they live with constant economic stress.
yeah. And you know what? The when parents are stressed, children are more likely to get sick because children are very sensitive to the stresses of their parents. That actually affects their immune system. So, for example, just one obvious example, studied repeatedly and reported over and over again, the more stressed parents are, the more likely kids are to have asthma.
Oh, wow, I didn't even know that, but
Oh yeah,
I know.
oh yeah. Not only that, it's even been shown that the worse the mental health of the parents, the more asthma medication the child will need. And here's the interesting thing. Asthma is such a great example because how do we treat it? You know how we treat it? We give people adrenaline or its analogs to open up the airways, and we give them cortisol to suppress the inflammation. Now, what are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones, which
Wow.
means that the stress of children has been exhausted by the stress on the parents, and now their lungs. Not only that, black American women, the more episodes of racism they face, the higher the risk of asthma. And that's been shown. Not only that, a recent study from Harvard 4 years ago showed that the more symptoms of PTSD a woman has, the greater her risk for ovarian cancer. So women with severe PTSD have double the risk of ovarian cancer. I mean, these are all, now nobody gets PTSD on their own. PTSD is a interrelational and social event. And so that, again, going back to your work and your very comprehensive program to reduce stress, to build community, to spend more time with doctors so that people have a chance to have a more holistic approach to their health, prevention, not just in the sense of telling people not to smoke, but also in terms of supporting families at risk, teaching and advocating for and providing conditions for emotional health in the schools. You know, these are just so they're so obvious that it's shocking that a political candidate even talk about. I mean, good on you for doing so, but it's shocking.
Well, so much of this has to do with public policy.
Yeah,
So this illusion that you can just handle all these things by yourself,
yeah,
you've talked about systemic racism in just the last few minutes, talking about how Black women will be more susceptible to something, the sacrifice zones, of course, where the environmental toxins are greater. And we can't, this goes back to the original commentary, that the quote you mentioned that politics is medicine,
yeah,
collective medicine.
yeah,
We can't leave politics out of addressing these issues because, you know, fewer and fewer people, a shrinking portion of the population, are able to override some of these factors simply because they can afford to buy more expensive food or something.
Yeah.
So, and at this point, 46% of all the water wells in urban America are filled with PFAS, those forever chemicals.
But
The car-
educate me on what that is. I don't even know.
oh, the PFAS are these forever chemicals
Oh,
that don't break down.
okay.
They've even found chips of plastic in the human heart.
Mm.
I mean, we're just, but the system as it is now is so resistant to the kind of repair work that needs to be done. And this repair work does need to be done collectively. That's been obvious from everything you've said. But you know, what I see as a candidate, and what anybody sees looking at these things from a political perspective, is you encounter the resistance of a political system that doesn't want to address any of these things, because that would affect its bottom line. I mean, all the deregulations when it came to food, this is where all of this comes from. You know, they call it job killing regulations. Well, it's job killing I mean, it's body killing deregulation. It's people killing deregulation. So I think a lot of it is about people waking up. And I think what happens, Gabor, is that some people are just so beaten down and depressed by the whole thing.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the, if I can be self-serving enough to mention a book of mine that you've endorsed, The Myth of Normal. I think that one of the ways of social control in this society, and by the way, I grew up in communist Hungary, and so I experienced social control. Let me tell you, the social control here is so much more sophisticated and so much more effective than it ever was in that, under that brutally oppressive system, because it's so subtle. And one of the ways of social control is creating this sense of passive helplessness in people, so that even when they see something going on, like only two kinds of people who would deny climate change these days. One is corporate entities who profit off it, and they still are fighting that battle. They're doing it very cynically. But there's also a lot of people who are emotional denial of their own trauma, and they don't want to face the danger. It's too painful for them. But most people, I think, recognize that there's something happening with the climate. How can they not? You know, but we're also passive in the face of it. We don't know what to do, and our politicians won't do anything, and people just live their lives. That sort of passivity, that disengagement from the process, is a way of social control. And if you look at what percentage of people even vote in an election?
well, what you're saying is so true. I have talked to people quite a bit on the campaign trail about how, if it has to do with our personal lives, they read books like yours, people get very sophisticated about understanding the psychological dynamics that are involved in our own oppression and so forth. If I'm in a toxic relationship with someone, if I'm traumatized by the toxicity in particular personal circumstance, we know about setting boundaries, we know about taking care of yourself and so forth. But when it comes to our public conversation, particularly our political conversation, we've all been trained to keep it very shallow.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's very, very subtle. And we've been trained to kind of dumb it down. We've been trained to just act like and think like sixth graders. And that's why the system does not change. We are convinced, like I see it in my run all the time. I mean, all they have to do is create a narrative like she can't win.
Yeah.
All they have to do is create a narrative like she's kooky. All they have to do is create a narrative like she's not the serious candidate, and she's not a serious candidate.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're the only candidacy talking about such serious things as this, such serious things as childhood hunger, such serious things as lack of health care, such serious things as carcinogens in our food, such serious things about root cause healing, peace building, and so forth. But people just go along with it almost like they're in a trance.
Yeah.
And you're right, it is a level of social control. But I am shocked sometimes by people who would never allow themselves to be so played in their individual lives, wouldn't stand for it, and yet don't seem to realize that we're all like lemmings. And you see it, of course, happening with the climate. We're being warned. It's
Yeah.
not like we haven't been warned. It's not like we're not seeing it. It's not even that we've been warned. We're seeing it right in front of us, and still people unwilling to change.
Well, you know what's interesting? Let me say a couple of things here. One is just to reinforce what you just said here. If in your personal life you know somebody who made promises and they did the opposite consistently,
Right.
if in your personal life said, I'm the greatest, trust in me, you know, I'm right all the time, you know, if in your personal life you met somebody who was totally callous to people suffering, would you want anything to do with that person?
Exactly. I say that all the time. I say these politicians are like people who come back every 4 years. It's like a boyfriend or a husband has just cheated on you and cheated on you and cheated on you. Says, "Oh, honey, let me have it one more time." And you get to where you go, "No, I'm not going to give it to you one more time." And yet they're about to, people are still talking about giving it to them one more time. And the climate change is a perfect example, And we have a president who's talked about how he's the climate change president.
Yeah.
And there have been these healthy investments in green energy, actually, in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are very good. On the other hand, it's all he's given more oil drilling permits than even Trump did, and he's okayed the Willow project, which is an $8 billion ConocoPhillips oil extraction program on the North Slopes of Alaska. So there's this kind of playing, it's like the purse thief. It's like, look here so you don't look there. We would never stand for this. We would never stand for this in our personal lives. And then if somebody pointed out, then you shoot the messenger. Like, are you hopeful?
Well, let me tell you an amusing story first, okay? Do you remember the neurologist and writer Oliver Sacks?
Yeah.
Okay. So in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, very famous book, he was working on a neurology ward with people who are aphasiacs. Aphasiacs have had a stroke in a certain part of their brain. They can't process language. So this group of aphasiacs are watching Ronald Reagan make a political speech on television. And most of them are laughing their heads off. And some of them look totally outraged. And Sachs says, is it that these people don't understand Reagan? Or is it that they understand him all too well? Well, what was going on is that aphasiacs, they can't understand words. Therefore, they read body language and facial expression and tone of voice. As a result, on studies, they're much more able to tell when somebody's lying than the average person. Because the average person is taken in by words and they totally ignore their gut feelings. And these aphasiacs, that's all they got to go by. So they know who to trust and who not to trust much better than the rest of us do.
That's fascinating.
So I'm just
That's
sometimes
fascinating.
it just suggests to people, turn off the sound, watch their faces, look how their smiles in their mouths don't match their eyes. Or don't listen to the words, listen to the tone of their voices. So part of the reason that people can get away with it in politics, because people are so divorced from their gut, which
Well,
is another product of living in this society.
when I'm thinking of everything you just said in relation to Donald Trump,
Yeah.
and if you turned off the sound,
Yeah.
even if you keep the sound on, he's got that angry look on his face. It's very much like a Hitler or a Mussolini.
Yeah.
But this is what I don't understand. Some very, very nice people that I have known don't see it that way.
I know, me too. I've met lovely people who believe that Michelle Obama is a transvestite. I mean, drivers who've driven me in the States on various speaking engagements. Because you know what I think it is? I think people are disconnected. You talked about this before. These are lovely people. They're good people. Hillary Clinton was so wrong to call them a basket of deplorables. That was a terrible thing she said, because it was so demeaning of the humanity of people. But a lot of people in the society, because of some of the trauma that you do talk about in your program, are so disconnected from the intelligence of their hearts and the feelings in their guts that you can fool them. And I think that's what's going on, is that on a large scale, people are alienated from themselves. They're disconnected from themselves. So they don't have handle on reality. And they're also so traumatized. They're looking for strong people to take care of them. And so when you come along and you say, let's be compassionate and let's care about the vulnerable ones, there's something in some people that says, no, let them take care of themselves. You know why? Because nobody took care of them.
Yeah. The abuser, the one who is abused, becomes an abuser. The
Yeah,
one who was neglected doesn't see a problem with neglecting others, and that goes back, of course, to what you were saying about Trump and his own family. I think that the majority of Americans, because I think the majority of people on the
yeah,
planet are good, decent people. I do believe that with all my heart.
yeah,
But what you see among haters and the really pathological is a kind of conviction behind the
yeah.
pathology and conviction behind the hate. And those of us who love, those of us who believe in justice, those of us who believe in mercy, need to become as convicted behind our dedication to love and justice and compassion as some people are behind their hate, because conviction is a force multiplier.
You know, people talk about bleeding heart liberals,
Mm-hmm.
I think a heart should bleed. When we
Mm-hmm.
look at the suffering world, even if you don't agree, even if politically you have totally different opinions, when you see suffering, at least your heart should bleed a little bit. You should feel something. You should feel some pain. And even if you're going to argue, say in the current terrible situation in the Middle East, even if you're going to argue purely for one side or the other, at least your heart should bleed for the suffering. That's all around, and it's so hard for people. It's just so hard for people, and in such a painful time. You talked about the divisions and the hatreds and so on. At a time of stress and insecurity, people tend to go into their most primitive defensive uh, neurological states, which is withdrawal or attack. And at that point, the midfrontal cortex, where compassion and empathy and insight and self-awareness are modulated, it goes offline. And these days, it's not people's fault. They're under such stress for reasons that you've talked about. They've been traumatized for reasons that your program addresses. And they've been so dislocated that literally um, it's the emotions of hostility and defensiveness and small group identification take over, where our larger circuits of humanity and connection go silent. And that's what's happening in a big way. This is what your campaign is trying to undo. Uh, you're trying to provide a sense of connection, which is so lacking.
I think that a problem we have politically is we think we have compassion, but the people on the other side don't. I
Yeah,
think even, I mean, the right versus the left, the far right versus the far left on Israel and Palestine, to me, are mirrors of each other. Unwillingness to feel deep compassion for the one that they don't feel compassion for. And
yeah,
I find the hatefulness on both sides really horrifying and deeply disturbing to me. It's that Rumi poem, out beyond all ideas of good and bad, right or wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there. That's the only place where we can meet. But when you said a minute ago, it's not their fault. I think the issue of, I think there's a whole conversation there actually, because we've all been hurt to some extent. But what is the Hemingway line? I don't want to, I hate to butcher Hemingway, but it was something along the line of everybody's been hurt. Some people grow strong in the wounded places.
mm,
And I think that the fact that we're all traumatized should not be, I mean, should be described as you so brilliantly describe it.
well, no way,
But I don't,
no
not
way.
excused in some of those ways. What were you going to say?
Well, first of all, when you quoted the Hemingway, Mark Twain came to my mind,
Yeah,
and
what did he say?
for instance, like, um, there were some terrible events in my life, and some of them even happened. Something like that. but but but
He was so
but
brilliant.
but the
He was so
distinction
brilliant.
the distinction I want to make is between fault and responsibility. I didn't say people don't have responsibility. I
Yeah,
said it's not,
exactly.
you know,
It's not there. Yeah, thank you for that's brilliantly put. Yeah,
we we,
yeah.
we can take responsibility for something when we become aware. You know, like it's not our fault that stuff happened to us and shaped our minds in certain ways. But we can't take responsibility today. You know, Trump may have had a childhood which was really horrible, but the responsibility to actually look at himself and to find some other truths, that's on him. And that's on all of us. And both you and I have our share of, I don't want to speak for your life. I've had my share of traumas in my life. I've had my share of dysfunctions. I've had my share of hurting others, you know. And at some point, when we do enough self-reflection, we can take responsibility for that, you know, and responsibility, not in a sense of guilt, but in the sense of, as everybody says, the capacity, the ability to respond, you know. And again, to go back to your program, Marianne, I just think it's a very responsible program. I think
Oh,
it,
thank
I
you.
think it responds to what's going on right now in a very astute and very deep and very well thought out way. So I wish as an American so I could vote for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you are such a blessing on all of us, Gabor. You're like, I think so many of us feel he's my friend. And I'm so grateful to be able to say that. And it's actually true. You have been very good to me. And I remember when you and I had lunch in Vancouver one day, and I said, I'm thinking of running for president again. Do you remember that exchange?
Yeah. And
And you said, yeah. You're
how, how
going
did I
in and out.
how did I respond?
Well, it was interesting because you said, "Oh, good," and then a couple of minutes later, you said, "Wait a minute, you know you won't win, right?"
Yeah.
And I went just without even thinking about it. I said, "How do you know?" And you were sort of taken aback, and you said to me a few minutes later, "I'm glad that you responded that way,"
Yeah.
and it meant
Yeah.
a lot to me that you affirmed my confidence. Listen, nothing is more offensive to the patriarchy than a confident woman, and I've certainly learned it's almost a price we pay, Gabor. Maybe you'll write about that someday.
And not
Um,
only that, you know, um,
Pardon?
but whether you win or not, you've already won
Oh,
because
thank you, darling.
because what you're doing is you're doing your best to bring some light into the world, to bring some compassion into the world, to bring some sense of collective belonging into the world. And polls or votes aside, that's already a contribution. So you can't lose this one.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming on with me. I know that it's meant a lot to the people who are listening. The replay will mean so much to people. Um, do you have anything going on specific that you want to tell people about? Obviously, we all know about your books, Myth of the Normal, which has meant so much to all of us, Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, and so forth. Anything else particularly you want to leave us with in words of wisdom?
You know, um, that's always a tempting offer. What else have you got to say, Gabor? You know, because
Yeah, I know.
but,
I
but
know. I thought after I asked him, I thought he's probably going, thanks, Marianne. I
right,
know.
right now, I think the better part of this question is to just to thank you for this opportunity to spend time with you. It's always a pleasure. And
Thank you.
what I got to say, I say it in other forums. So I think thank you, but no, I won't add anything else.
Thank you for your support personally. Thank you for your support politically. For those of you who have been listening to us, thank you. God bless you. Gabor, I love you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, you take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.